Okay.
Excellent. Yes, so we can hear you well. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Garner. I'm the parent lead of the Plainfield Special Education Parent Advisory Committee. We're so excited you could join us today to talk about our parent needs assessment survey that we did during the 23-24 school year. And I'm so excited to be able to introduce one of our longtime SEPAC members, Jade Presnell, who is also the policy analyst at the Human Services Research Group. Did I get all that right, Jade?
Yes.
Excellent. And she is the one who created the survey and analyzed the results. So she's going to go over that with us today. I am recording this session in case we have any administrators or school board members who aren't here able to attend in person. You guys are welcome to ask questions at any point during the presentation if there's something that you want to know more of, or if you have questions that you'd rather not be recorded. When Jade finishes her presentation, I will stop the recording and we can absolutely continue questions at that point. So Jade, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you give us the results.
Okay, wonderful. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I recognize that we all have very busy schedules and it is late and it's a Tuesday and we're all ready for fall break. So thank you for being here. I am excited to share the results of our Special Education Parent Advisory Committee Needs Assessment. Now, let's see. Okay, wonderful. And I am not great at monitoring chat and I can't see everyone very well. So please just interrupt me if you have questions or something I'm saying is not clear or I'm not making sense. But I want to go through some important results that we found because I'm very excited. I think there's some really amazing things going on in our district, as we all know. And then, of course, there are always ways we can improve. So just to share a little bit about us. We are SEPAC, we're the Plainfield Special Education Parent Advisory Committee. We are a collaborative group of parents of students receiving special education services in Plainfield who really act as liaisons to district leadership to let them know what some of the challenges are and what are some of the successes of our students who are receiving special education services. We really work to make recommendations that are in the best interest of all students who are receiving special education services. We really want to ensure that every student is provided with a positive and equitable school experience. I think our values very much already align with our district values surrounding inclusion and equitable opportunity. And so we are one group that came together to really just kind of have a voice for students who are receiving special education services. And we really want to empower families to have the tools and resources to be successful. As parents, whether or not you have a child with a disability or special needs or whatever you want to refer to it as, we recognize school can be challenging, right? And so the more that we can work together with our teachers and our administrators, the better off our children's educational experience will be. We really value transparent, positive, and solution-focused work, and we're really in this to support families together. We do meet monthly via Zoom, typically the second Tuesday of the month, and we'll share a little bit more about that at the end in case there's anybody here who is interested in joining a future meeting. We would love to have you. But that is just a little bit about who we are. And so a little bit of background about the survey. So I've been involved in SEPAC for a few years, although my involvement ebbs and flows with life, as you all can probably relate to. Stephanie has been an incredible fearless leader for our group. I also want to shout out to Beth Shepard, who has really just embraced our group and sits with us when we're talking about things that are going well, and we're talking also about things that maybe aren't going as well and that we want to improve. And we just really value her leadership and her support. Without her, our group certainly would not be able to do what it does. And we recognize that not all districts have that. And so we're very proud to be a part of Plainfield and to have, leadership support for our group and for the work that we want to do. So as we've met over the years, we've realized that we really want to represent all families who have students or children that are receiving special education services. And that's really difficult. It's difficult for a number of reasons. We know that typically parents of children with disabilities often have more demands that need to be met. They're often pretty overwhelmed, right, with caregiving duties and the extra responsibilities that come with having a child with some additional needs. And so it can be difficult for parents and caregivers to participate in our group. And so we're really putting our heads together and thinking, how can we really represent all students in the district? Because of course, as parents, we all come to the group with some of our personal motivations, but we are working for the common good, right? And so we realized that that was challenging to do because we really didn't have any data. And so we decided to come together and develop what we're referring to as a district-wide needs assessment. And I say needs assessment simply to let you know that this is really just kind of a baseline of where we are. And so we didn't really come into this with any particular research questions, but really just to gather a general idea of the landscape of how satisfied parents are with how things are going. And when I say parents, I use that term loosely. It could be a caregiver, it could be anybody who really provides that day-to-day support for the student. So we decided to develop a survey. It was a group effort. I led it, of course. I do have a background in research, particularly disability-related research is an area that I'm really passionate about. So I had the opportunity to lead this. I looked at other surveys that had been developed for other districts, other states, and then I also looked at the peer review literature to see really what is important to student success and also family and caregiver satisfaction. And we'll go more into the different domains that we looked at here shortly. The survey was sent out in the spring of this year. I believe it was March and April that we sent it out. I also believe it was shared with approximately 800 families, and that's again an approximation in terms of how many students we have in our district who are receiving special education services. The responses were all anonymous, so we have no idea who participated in this survey. There were 51 questions total. There were 49 multiple choice questions and 2 open-ended questions at the end of the survey where parents had the opportunity to let us know what was going well and then also what might be some challenges or areas of improvement. And the survey took about 10 or 15 minutes to complete. So that's just a basic overview. We also want to send out a really big thank you to everybody who took the time to fill out the survey. We recognize you get bombarded with lots of requests. And so thank you for giving us some feedback that we could really use to guide our work moving forward. And that was really, the motivation was two-part. One was so we could represent everyone as well as possible, but also to help us as a committee to know, where do we go from here? What are some of the gaps? Where, as a committee, can we be most effective in supporting our families and students? So, survey was sent out, we've gathered the data, we've analyzed the data, and now I want to share a little bit with you about what we found. And so who was the survey about, right? So mostly, who did we hear from? Now, I will tell you, we did not ask parents and caregivers to give their own demographics. We asked them to report on their students' demographics. So we had 136 total respondents. We did remove any surveys that were less than 50% complete because you can't really do a lot with surveys that aren't fully complete. And so we thought it was important to take those out. In terms of who was represented in our sample, it was mostly parents and caregivers of elementary age students. You see here 56% of the sample were elementary age students, 19% middle school, and then 24% were students in high school. In terms of student gender, male 66%, female 30%. In terms of ethnicity, students were predominantly were predominantly identified by their caregivers as white, 77%, and then bi or multiracial, 7%, Hispanic, Latinx, Mexicano, 5%, and then African American or Black were 4% of our students. And then we also asked caregivers to talk about their students' primary disability type. And the predominant disability type represented in this sample was psychiatric. And the examples that we gave for that were ADHD, anxiety, things like that. And so 24% identified as their students' primary disability as being psychiatric in nature. Then we have 23% with autism, 10% speech and language impairment. And then also not shown here, the next two, 8% were students with learning disabilities, and the next 8% were students with Down syndrome. And so just to kind of give you an idea of who we're talking about here, I'm sorry. And then in terms of placement, we did ask parents, about primary placement. And for this survey, most parents reported, 65% reported that their student spent most or all of the day in a gen ed setting, while 26% said most or all of the day in a special education setting. Okay, so that just gives you a little idea of our demographics here. Again, this is tapping into parental and caregiver perspective, not student perspective. Okay, I just want to make sure that's reinforced. So to recap our survey, we had a few different domains. We looked at parental educational satisfaction. We looked at parental perspectives surrounding school culture, school collaboration, communication and information sharing, and then also their perspective on how the case conference or IEP meetings are going. The right column just indicates how many questions or items were in each of those domains. And then just as a reminder, especially if you didn't see the survey, that every question had response options that were Likert type options that ranged from strongly disagree to strongly agree. I also want to point out that there were some questions that had a not applicable listed on them in case they weren't applicable to the student. So let's dig into the results. And so I'm really mostly going to be talking about descriptive results. I also want to caution everybody here to, it's always good, right, to consume data with a level of intentionality, a level of skepticism. This is not an opportunity to reflect on a specific school or a specific grade level or a specific teacher. This is just really speaking generally across the district and how parents are feeling regarding their satisfaction with the educational services that their student is receiving. And so you can see basically what I did here is if any respondent had strongly disagree or somewhat disagree, then I put that percentage, I combined them and put them in the disagree column, and the same went for agree. So if the respondent said somewhat agree or strongly agree, we combined those numbers, and that is how we came up with that percentage on the right side. It just makes the data a little more digestible. And so what you can see here is that overall parents are pretty satisfied, right, with the educational services that their students are receiving, which is really exciting to see. I actually highlighted some of the numbers that stuck out to me. So in terms of placement, you see that 88% of parents agreed that they were satisfied with their child's placement. I think that's a very positive thing that's worth highlighting. If you're a parent here and you've been on this journey long enough, you know that sometimes those things can be challenging, and there can be, different perspectives on where a student is best served and where they should spend their time. So it was very exciting to see that the majority of parents who responded were pleased with their child's placement. Also, overall pleased with special education services and general education services. And we're going to get into a little bit more nitty-gritty with that specific, those specific items a little bit later. But just generally, you can see that overall parents are feeling pretty satisfied with the instruction, the quality of support, and the services that their students are receiving. And this is across grades, okay? Having all the, okay. So school collaboration. Can't see very well with this. I'm sorry, one moment. Okay. I hate not being able to see everybody, but feel like I'm just talking to myself here. School collaboration was another domain that we looked into. And so here we really asked about, how well is our district doing on collaborating with parents and families? And so are teachers inviting parents to participate in the decision-making process? Are they asking them to be involved? And we thought school collaboration was really important to tap into because we know that the research says that the more collaboration and the stronger partnerships that parents have with their teachers and the educational team, the better the outcomes are for their student. And so school collaboration is an area I think also our committee is naturally aligned with, right? That we want to be collaborative with our teachers and our administrators, and we really want to work together. And so here, again, overall, we see pretty strong agreement on school collaboration. Now, one thing I want to point out, we did, for some questions, ask about teachers, and then we also asked the same question about administrators. And if you see the agreement percentage for administrators invite me to participate in the decision-making process surrounding important decisions that will affect my child is a bit lower compared to the percentage of agreement in the other categories. But I will say that this is something that I saw consistently across the survey. And so there was, for each one of those questions, a neither agree nor disagree response. And that question, any questions that asked about administrators tended to have a pretty high neither agree nor disagree. And so about a quarter of the sample would indicate that an uncertainty or ambivalence when responding to items about administrators. And so that is not a negative thing. That just tells us that, right, parents are spending more time in some of these areas with teachers than they are administrators. And that makes sense, right? And I think that's a worthwhile talking point at the end as well, just to kind of say, what are administrators' role, their various roles, and how do families see that role? And so I would say interpret the percentages around those items with some caution, because I don't think parents felt really comfortable answering those specific items, probably because they've had less contact with the administrators than the teachers, okay? Particularly around some of these very specific engagement-oriented questions. In terms of the school facilitating involvement, teachers considering parents as equal partners, listening to their suggestions, and working together collaboratively, there were high levels of agreement across all of those items, which is really positive. Now, of course, if we want to be the very best that we can be, we would hope that we'll continue to see that those percentages around agreement increase, right? So that is about school collaboration. We also asked about school culture. And school culture, we know, is really impactful in not only surrounding student outcomes, but students' just overall emotional and mental well-being. And so that was an area that we really wanted to tap into. And so you'll see I have two slides because we had a number of questions surrounding the school environment or the school culture. And so here we asked about, teachers and administrators' expectations about their students reaching their full potential, particularly again, right? We're talking about students with disabilities. And so that is really, really important, that presumed competence, that we come to the table saying, you know what, this student can reach their full potential despite there being, a number of challenges or additional needs that need to be met. And I was really excited to see that 86% of respondents agreed to that particular question, that teachers expect their child to reach their full potential. That is so valuable, and that is something that we want to continue to embrace and encourage throughout our district. We know, right? I mean, that there's stigma surrounding disability and what students with disabilities can and can't do, and those assumptions can really hinder our kids. We also asked about just showing sensitivity to the needs of students with disabilities and showing a positive outlook. Again, I think any parent here will recognize that it is difficult when you're met with a lot of assumptions or negativity surrounding what your child can and can't do. And so again, very exciting to see that there were fairly high levels of agreement about these positive expectations and students reaching their full potential. Again, I would interpret these lower percentages about the questions specific to administrators with caution. I don't think that those numbers are probably very beneficial. And I think probably in a future survey, what we might want to do is add an additional optional section at the end that, hey, if you have regular contact with one of your school admins, would you like to then answer these questions, right? Because I just don't think that there's probably been a lot of that. More one-on-one contact with administrators as we see with teachers. And that makes total sense. So again, continuing with school culture, talking about creative ways to meet our children's learning needs. 72% agreed with that. These two questions were a little bit tricky, and as a team or as a committee, we really struggled with, should we ask parents about what they believe their child feels? And again, one of our limitations of this survey is that we don't have also an aligned survey for students, right? So it'd be really interesting to compare for students who are maybe a little bit older, who are a little more actively engaged in at school with teachers, kind of what their perceptions are around feeling valued and feeling safe. But right now, we were curious to hear from parents, and we got high levels of agreement with that, which is really exciting, right? We want all children, all students to feel safe and feel valued at school. I was also excited to see that there's fairly good agreement with teachers being creative and meeting their learning needs. I know that we're, being a parent of an 11-year-old with Down syndrome, we're always getting creative on what we can do to better support him. And it's been really fantastic when we've worked with teachers and staff and who have just been kind of out of the box in their thinking. And I love that. Now, one thing I want to note, these last two questions, we were really interested in terms of culture, how schools across our district are celebrating disability. And I recognize that might sound strange to some, but if you're part of the disability community, right, we really, for the most part, are embracing this neurodiversity and differences that our children bring into the world. And so I think the more that schools can do the same, the more other students recognize that disability is just a natural extension of the human experience. And we can continue to talk about disability in a more positive and strengths-based way. And so you'll see those percentages were lower on the lower end in terms of parents' perception of whether their students' classroom participates in these disability awareness events or the school participates in disability awareness events. So that to me is one of those kind of, not a red flag, but it's a flag that says, hey, this is where SEPAC as a committee, we can really step in, right? And help kind of fill in this gap, because it is exciting when you see teachers and whole classrooms celebrating some of these events, because again, disability is something we want to continue to talk about. So for our next section, we have a very long section on communication and information sharing. Probably could have broken this section down into two different domains, but hindsight's 2020. So, but you'll notice there are two slides that talk about communication and information sharing. And communication is really tapping not necessarily into like the collaborative working together process, but how do you feel things are going in regard to getting information, getting access to resources, knowing how your student is doing at school, knowing their progress towards goals. And so what you can see here is overall high levels of agreement. We see a little bit lower level of agreement with I am satisfied with the degree to which teachers communicate with me. And so that's something I highlighted that we can talk more about when we get to the key takeaways, because I think that might be an area that we can target, that we can really work on strengthening. And I will say I have a spouse who's a teacher, and I recognize that teachers are superstars and they've got a million and one things going on, and it can be very difficult sometimes to take those extra steps to communicate with parents, or send home that spelling list early and things like that. And so this is not to say that teachers are not doing well with communication. It's just an area to highlight that maybe we can try to, continue to strengthen and improve, given that we know that teachers have a huge amount of demands and it can be difficult. And sometimes our families do require a little bit more communication, a little bit more hand-holding. And so we recognize that that can be difficult. So, and communication certainly is a two-way street, right? So this is why we also asked about, parents' perspective on their role. So I discuss my child's needs with their teachers. I discuss my child's goals, progress, that sort of thing. And we see high levels of agreement there, which is not surprising, right? Because most people will probably rate themselves a little bit more favorably on some of those domains. Also, we see that teachers are making themselves available to talk with families. One area that we see a little bit higher disagreement on is the item that talks about general education and special education teachers working together collaboratively to assure that our children's IEPs are being implemented. And so you'll see 16% of respondents disagreed there. And so I would love to know, right, like what's happening there? What might be some of the barriers there? And again, we recognize that it takes time and, extra time to do some of these extra things surrounding collaboration and working together. But of course, those things are very valuable in setting our students up for success. And also at the bottom, you'll note my child's educational team communicates regularly with me regarding my child's progress on IEP goals. 98% of this sample identified that their student did have an IEP, and 19% disagreed with this. So I, again, would want to know kind of what's going on here. I know we have some of those mandatory check-ins for IEPs, but are families feeling like they want more check-ins? Are they feeling like they're just not really in tune with what's happening towards goal progression? And so again, would love to know a little bit more there, but it's something just to kind of keep in mind as we move forward. And to continue talking about communication and information sharing, just two things that I want to note. Well, one thing I really want to note here is that we saw some higher levels of disagreement with being provided resources. So we asked whether the child's educational team provides the family with resources. specifically for students with disabilities, and whether they are provided with resources to engage in learning activities at home. And so we saw lower levels of agreement, or alternately higher levels of disagreement on those two items. So again, I think that's an area where we as a committee can try to direct our work to make sure that we are getting families the resources they need. Again, I would say that, what expectations families have around what resources teachers and schools should provide is probably very different. And so there's going to be some more variability there. But as a committee, those are the things that really help us understand where we can be most effective. And finally, this is our last section. And we just asked about the case conference or IEP meeting process. And these questions are fairly standard questions, I believe, that the state has set forth for parents in terms of their participation in these meetings. And across the board, we see really high levels of agreement here. And so the only question would be the last row that talks about, providing students with all the services documented in their IEPs. We see a little bit lower levels of agreement there. So I would kind of question, what's going on there. Again, we do have that opportunity, or we did have that opportunity for open-ended feedback at the end, which really helped to give some context to some of these questions. But of course, there are still some areas that are a little unclear, and that would be one. Why are parents disagreeing with this? Are they feeling like there's something that maybe their student would benefit from that they're not receiving? We also know that we rely on external vendors and partners for a lot of these additional services, and the disability sector in general is struggling, right, with staff, and so there are sometimes needs that are not being met. So in terms of more advanced analysis, this is one thing that was found that I found very, very interesting. And I ran an analysis of variance and looked at the differences across satisfaction with both special education services and general education services based on grade, right? So we have three primary grades here. We have elementary students, middle school students, and high school students. And so what I found was that parental satisfaction with general and special education services was significantly different across grades. And what that means is that it's very unlikely that that difference was by chance. Okay, so it appears to be a statistically significant difference. And more specifically, what I found was that parents of elementary age students had significantly higher levels of satisfaction surrounding both general education services and special education services as compared to middle school, parents of middle school students and parents of high school students. Okay. And so the lowest level of educational satisfaction was found for parents of high school students. And so you'll see the means or the averages in that middle column. And so you can see here we have an average of 4.51 for elementary students in terms of their degree of satisfaction. And then for high school, it drops down to 3.33. And then again, we see the similar thing happen for general education. So we see these higher averages or higher levels of satisfaction, 4.55 for elementary students, and then that drops as students get older. And even more interesting was that the difference in satisfaction in terms of the drop was greater for parents' satisfaction with special education services than general education services. Okay. And so again, this is not to point out that things are not going well at the high school. That's not what this is meant to point out. It's meant to point out that something's happening. right? And again, if we had a larger sample, we had a more validated, reliable assessment, would really be interesting to see, are there potential interaction effects that are happening here? We recognize, and I don't have I'm not a parent of a high school student, so I don't know what that experience is like, particularly one that's receiving special education services. Um, but I imagine that high school's harder, right? There are a lot more demands put on high school students. We're also looking at, as parents, we're thinking about, oh my goodness, they're going to be graduating, they're going to be going, either some post-secondary option or into the workforce. Are they prepared? Right? And so I think this is an area that we can really just embrace and say, okay, let's see what's happening here. And also as a committee, how can we better support these families? Right? So there's some struggle there. They're not feeling, as children age, parents are feeling less satisfied with both general education services and special education services, more so for special education services. Now, what I would love to know is if that's a trend that we see that maybe across the nation. I don't know. I don't have that information, and perhaps somebody here in this group at the end can shed more light on that. But I thought it was really interesting. And so that was one of the interesting findings that I really wanted to highlight. Otherwise, there was not much significant going on in our sample. Okay. Also, I wanted to wrap up with talking a little bit about some of the open-ended feedback. So we had two questions at the end of the survey where we asked, what are we doing well? Right? And so I loved some of these quotes. We had a lot of feedback, which I really loved. All of that got shared with administration, so they have that and they can use that to their benefit. There's no secrets or anything like that. But I pulled out some of the quotes that really resonated with me, and I don't want to go through and read these, but just some of the things that families love is teachers' willingness to listen to our concerns, listen to our recommendations, being willing to pivot, right? Adjust plans. Um, there was some varying feedback around communication. There appeared to be families, caregivers that felt like communication was really strong, and then others that felt like communication was an area that they struggled in. And so, again, how can we as a committee really support families in better communicating with their educational team? My child feels included and safe at school. I would say any parent loves that, right? And that's important to them. I appreciate feeling that I have an important role in her education planning. This by far is the best school that I've seen that takes care of all our needs. Thank you for everything you do. My child's special education point person is responsive, always willing to make additions to the IEP. And then the final quote, I appreciate the positivity that surrounds my child and having special needs. I think the district has done a wonderful job seeing that kids are kind and understand that some folks have special needs. So just really want to shout out to all of our teachers and administrators for all of the amazing work that you're doing. To see these quotes, I think from families and parents was just really exciting, because I think there's so much wonderful work that's happening and families are really feeling that. We also asked about, where can we improve, right? And so I love that we have district leadership that's like, hey, yeah, we love hearing all the good stuff, but we also want to know, what's not really going well? How can we do better? And so I think that is the growth mindset that's going to get us where we need to be. And so people had a lot of suggestions, right? And we recognize that it's not a perfect world and we can't certainly meet everybody's needs in this imperfect world that we live in, but we can do our best. And of course, districts are limited by policy, legislation, lots of things that can make it difficult sometimes to implement some of these changes. But of course, there was a lot of conversation around smaller caseloads, particularly at the high school level. There was some feedback around, instead of having annual IEP meetings, could we have more frequent check-ins? There was also the recommendation to please hire more special education teachers so the ones we have are not stretched so thin. I also want to shout out to our amazing special education teachers that are doing such great work, and we recognize that it's not always easy work. Any teacher I believe would agree with that. I'm sure would agree with that, but especially our special education teachers that tend to have to balance a lot of demands and are meeting a lot of different needs for a lot of different students. So thank you for all the work that you do. And also, the administrator, or I'm sorry, the aides that work with our students as well. So we value you so much. So here, again, we see some conflicting feedback around communication. So some families felt communication was really strong. Others felt that communication was sometimes challenging. And if you don't have a child that has, some communication challenges, it's hard to understand how valuable that piece is, but it is difficult sometimes as a parent to know what's happening at school, what's going well, not what's not going well. And so that's one area that we want to really continue to focus on. Talking, some suggestions about just ongoing training and how to work with children who have learning differences. There was a comment about remembering to provide grace with families. And I certainly that resonated with me. Kindness and compassion go a long way. And we recognize that we don't always have the same opinions, right? And there will be times on our teams where we disagree. And so how can we work through that and still be kind and compassionate to one another? And then finally, this last quote, of course, really stuck out to me because in my policy work, we're doing a lot around employment. And so there was the recommendation to really encourage the special education program in the district to use all the resources available to them, contracted particularly through the state, and some out of the box thinking on employment opportunities. And we know, right, that individuals with disabilities, particularly intellectual and developmental disabilities, have abysmal rates of community integrated employment. And at the high school level, that is typically at the forefront of many parents' minds. And so figuring out how can we really set our students with disabilities up for success after they graduate. So that was some of the feedback. So some of our key takeaways. Again, I just want to really reinforce that about a quarter of the sample typically express some ambivalence when answering questions about the school administrators. And so that would suggest to me that they just don't have that information to answer those questions well. So I would really interpret those numbers with caution. Another key takeaway is that satisfaction with educational support was highest for elementary age students and lowest for parents of high school students. So how can we really hone in on that and make some improvements there? Overall, there was really strong parental satisfaction with school collaboration. Parents expressed high levels of agreement with being partners and being actively involved in decision making, which is awesome. Similarly, there was strong agreement with the fact that we have a district culture that is generally characterized by positivity and that a belief that all of our students can reach their full potential, which is very valuable. And then another key takeaway is just to note that there was some variability surrounding communication. So some saw it as a strength in our district, others saw it as an opportunity for improvement, and that there were higher levels of dissatisfaction with communication, particularly from teachers, and then also some of the perceived collaboration between gen ed and special education teachers. And so again, this is perspective, does not mean that that's not going well. It's parent caregiver perspective. So again, it's just an area that we can hone in on to really improve. And then another key takeaway is that families may benefit from some additional resources to really help them access, the things that will help their child have a good life. And these systems can be complicated to navigate, and so it's important that we really help equip families with that. I know if I hadn't worked in the waiver for as long as I have, I would I would be clueless. It's quite overwhelming. And I imagine it's equally overwhelming for teachers who probably have little knowledge of how the waiver works, because they're focused on teaching our students. So now what? So where can we go from here? Our committee is really going to dig into these findings together and determine what our next steps will be. But based on what we found, these were some general suggestions that came from that. And the first is really just to build off our strengths, right? Continuing to promote a positive district culture surrounding disability, surrounding our students with disabilities so they can reach their full potential. Really continue that strong collaboration with parents and caregivers as team partners and experts, right? Parents do have some expertise they can bring to the table surrounding their child. And so really embracing that and working together as a team. Um, Also, embracing disability awareness. And so looking at possibilities for incorporating more opportunities to celebrate disability through different special events, whether it's World Autism Month or World Down Syndrome Day. I know my son has had some amazing teachers who have really embraced celebrating World Down Syndrome Day, and it's spread school wide, but we don't necessarily see that happening everywhere. So how can we really embrace that fully as a district and engage parents and families in that too, right? So not putting that on the school, but putting that really as a collective effort that we work together to spread that awareness. And also identifying solutions, right? So this is we have some data now. So we know that there's some significant differences in satisfaction with educational services. So what might be accounting for the change that we see as students get older and across grades? How can we increase families' access to resources? And how can we help parents be better communicators with teachers and vice versa? And then, of course, what else, right? I'm sure you all have some ideas and thoughts on where we can go from here. And so we're excited to really dig into that. Just to wrap up with some limitations. This is not a perfect survey, right? We did not use like a validated measure. We created a survey that was very specific to what we wanted to know, that has its strengths and its limitations. The survey was only in English. We did not capture, families who might be non-native English speakers. We also recognize that was noted in the open-ended feedback that respondents may have limited interactions with administrators. That was written in the feedback, as well as some parents feeling like they don't have good knowledge of the school environment or culture, particularly for older students, which makes sense, right? When they get older, they don't want to talk to us as much. We don't get as much information about what's happening at school because they're older and they're cool and they don't want to hang out with us as much as they used to. Um, Again, response bias. Typically, with any survey, you have people who are very satisfied, love everything, and people who are very dissatisfied that tend to respond, right? But you'll get that in any survey, but just something to consider. And then we had about a 17% response rate. So that's not horrible. It's not great. Would love to see that number higher if we are able to send the survey out again in the future, which we hope to do. And so typically we see about a 20% response rate, which is low. We were a little bit lower than that, but still decent. Okay, but it is, there are limitations. So again, interpret this information cautiously. Looking forward, love to know if you have any feedback whether you want to share that tonight or you want to write the committee and share some feedback, what questions you have. We just wanted to let you know that we are hoping to really fine tune the survey. Again, some of the questions, pertaining to administrators or, the school in general, those questions probably weren't as great as they could be. When you say my child's school, who does that mean, right? Who are we really talking about there? And so it can be, again, some of the questions can be better. And so we really want to improve the survey. We're hoping that maybe every spring we could send it out so we can really see what's happening over time. And we want to continue to use our findings to really guide and strengthen the work of our committee. We do hope also that we see our committee grow in membership and impact. We hope that you'll consider joining us if you are a parent of a student who is receiving special education services. Um, we recognize that commitments are challenging, but we would love to have you. No special skills or abilities required, we promise. We'd love to meet you. We'd love to have you join us. And I have another slide on that in case you're interested. And then, of course, we really want to see more special education parent advisory committees being developed across the state. This is such a great opportunity for parents to really be engaged with the district, to get to know leadership, to get to know teachers better, and to really develop that common framework that, hey, we are here to work together. And I will say, I got off social media a long time ago, but you hear the best of the best and the worst of the worst. And I would say one of our greatest strengths is that we have a district that wants to work with us and that we share similar values and similar goals. And so we hope that parents in other districts will also consider developing and implementing a SEPAC. So if you are considering joining us, our next meeting is Tuesday, October 15th, at 7 p.m. Typically we meet the third Tuesday. It's not,
It's the first Tuesday. So
oh, the
it's
first, sorry.
actually October 1st.
Yeah, I don't even know. Okay, thanks.
Yep,
So,
no problem. And it's normally the second Tuesday, but that falls during fall break. So we'll be on the 1st.
okay, great. So October 1st, better put that in my calendar. We will be meeting. We have some cool things that we're working on. We'd love to have you join us. If you can't attend every month, that's fine, but any help we can get, the better. You could email Beth Shepherd. Here is Beth's email, or you're welcome to throw your email and name in the chat, and we can send you the link to our next meeting. We would love for you to join us. And then we wanted just to highlight this opportunity. We are having our first SEPAC family engagement brunch. So please mark your calendar for Saturday, March 1st, from 10 to noon. It will be held at the Plainfield Administration Office. And this is just an opportunity for us to really eat some good food, which I'm a huge fan of brunch. So eat some good food and really engage with our district leadership and connect with each other. Um, you know, it's the disability community is powerful, and it's so great to meet other people, other parents, other families, so we can really get to know each other and support one another. So thank you. That is all I have, and I'd love, oh gosh, we're running out of time. I'd love to get some final thoughts or feedback, questions. I don't know, Steph, if we want to stop the recording.
Yeah, I can absolutely stop the recording.